I moved to Willow Creek because it felt like the end of the line, The place where you can finally breathe. I'd worked like a dog my whole life in New York, and when I managed to save enough to buy that house in Connecticut, it felt like I'd hit the adult life lottery. Willow Creek wasn't a movie-rich suburb, but it was decent. Middle class, immaculate lawns, blue hydrangeas in front of almost every house, and those white doors that always look freshly painted. The peace there was tangible. It was the kind of place where you could leave your bike unlocked on the porch and nobody would touch it. When I arrived, it was late May. The sun set late, golden light hitting the windows. I was exhausted from the move, but happy. The first week was nothing but unpacking boxes and meeting the neighbors. They were all very pleasant, in the way only suburban neighbors can be. Wide smiles, offers of banana bread, and detailed information about the best hardware store. My neighbor on the right, Linda, was the central figure there. A woman in her 60s, silver hair and a look that seemed to have seen more than she let on. She brought me an apple pie on the second day. "Welcome, dear," she said, setting the pie on my counter. "If you need anything, just holler. But there's one thing you need to know, Emily." I was already expecting a warning about trash pickup or HOA rules. "Go ahead, Linda." She didn't smile. Her face turned serious, and she glanced at the clock on my wall. It was 4 in the afternoon. Here in Willow Creek, we value peace. God's peace, peace of mind, and the peace of silence. "Oh, I love quiet. That's why I left New York," I said, laughing. Linda didn't laugh with me. "No, Emily, you don't understand. It's not about liking quiet. It's about respecting it, especially at night." She leaned in a little, and her voice dropped to a whisper, even though we were alone in the kitchen. "The rule here is simple. After 10 o'clock at night, silence is absolute." 10 o'clock! I frowned. "Like, no parties, I get that. But what if I want to watch a movie?" "No," she corrected, shaking her head. "Absolute. No music, no television, no blender, no loud conversations. If you're outside, you stop talking the moment you step onto the lawn. If you're inside, you move like you're walking on eggshells. It's Willow Creek's silent rule." I found it charming and kind of ridiculous at the same time. This was Connecticut, not a monastery. "All right, Linda. I'm a quiet person. 10 p.m. got it. I'll turn off the radio and behave." She squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "It's not about behaving, Emily. It's about safety. It's about staying safe." In that moment, I figured she meant burglars or some small-town legend, like the old lady who complains about noise. I promised I'd respect it, and she left, leaving me with the pie and a strange feeling. The next few days were about settling in. I started noticing the neighborhood routine. It was almost military. During the day, kids played, lawnmowers buzzed, and life looked normal. But as the clock crept toward 8 in the evening, the energy changed. It was as if the air grew heavier. Kids who'd been shouting in the street moments before were herded inside with impressive speed. Families watering flowers or chatting on porches would suddenly stand up and go in. There were no long goodbyes, no final laughs. It was an abrupt shutdown. By 9:30, Willow Creek was unrecognizable. Living room lights went out, and only dim bedroom or hallway lights stayed on, as if everyone were preparing to hibernate. Me, used to the constant noise of the big city, found the shift fascinating. I could hear crickets. I could hear wind in the leaves. It was a kind of peace I'd never experienced. But the peace was enforced. I started to feel that. One night, it was a Thursday, I was in my bedroom reading. The clock said 9:55 p.m. I remembered Linda's warning. 10 o'clock, absolute silence. I laughed to myself, thinking she was exaggerating. I went to the kitchen for a glass of water. My house was old, and the wooden floor creaked a little if I stepped too hard. I drank the water, and when I closed the fridge door, the click of the latch sounded too loud, like a gunshot. 10 o'clock on the dot. The silence that settled in was different from normal quiet. It was a vacuum. I was heading back to the bedroom when my phone, sitting on the counter, buzzed. It was a message from my sister. I picked it up to reply quickly, but clumsy as I was, I dropped it. The phone hit the kitchen's wooden floor with a dry, unexpected thud. It wasn't deafening. It was just the sound of a phone falling inside an empty house. I crouched to pick it up, a flare of irritation at my own awkwardness. But before I could even touch it, I heard it. It wasn't coming from inside my house. It was coming from outside. It was a sound I'd never heard before, and it froze me mid-crouch. A dragging sound, like something very heavy, metal or stone, being pulled across asphalt, but not continuously. It was intermittent, heavy and slow. Drag, pause drag. My heart started pounding, so hard it felt like it would crack my ribs. I looked out the kitchen window, but it was dark. All I could make out was the silhouette of the trees at the end of the street. And then the sound changed. The dragging stopped and was replaced by a kind of breathing. It wasn't human breathing, and it wasn't a dog's. It was deep, rough, and it sounded like it came from something that didn't need lungs to live. It was wet, like air being pulled through damp sand. I stayed there, frozen, my phone on the floor, unable to move, trying to understand what it was. It was terrifyingly close, like it was in the street, right in front of Linda's house. The rough breathing lasted about 10 seconds. Then I heard something else, subtler, but it chilled me to the bone. A click. It was mechanical, but not like a car. It sounded like a massive jaw opening and closing, or maybe a metal latch locking into place. And then it moved. The dragging started again, but this time it wasn't coming closer. It was leaving, heading toward the woods that bordered the neighborhood. Drag, drag. The sound faded, weaker and weaker, until it vanished completely into the night's silence. I stayed crouched for another 2 minutes, my body shaking, sweat running down the back of my neck. What the hell had that been? A garbage truck at the wrong hour? A big animal? No. It didn't sound like anything I knew. I picked up my phone. My hands were shaking, so badly I could barely hold it. I looked toward Linda's house. It was completely dark. Then fear kicked me into motion. I ran to my bedroom, locked the door, and crawled under the covers, curled into a ball. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, the sun brought back Willow Creek's fake normal. Lawnmowers started up again, and I felt like a paranoid idiot. It had to have been my imagination, or I was just exhausted. But I needed to know. The moment Linda opened her door to grab the newspaper, I hurried over. She was in her gardening clothes, her usual smile on her face. "Morning, Emily. Sleep well." "Linda, I need to talk to you about last night." Her smile vanished instantly. She pulled me inside and shut the oak door with a heavy click. "What happened, Emily?" Her voice was low and urgent. It was 10 o'clock. I dropped my phone. It was loud, I know. And after that, I heard something. Linda's eyes, usually kind, hardened. She looked at me like she was measuring whether I was lying or whether I understood what it meant. "What did you hear exactly?" she asked, almost demanding. "A dragging sound. Heavy. And then breathing. Wet. And a click. What was that, Linda? An animal. Some kind of crane." Linda took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and rubbed her forehead. "Emily, I warned you about the silent rule." "Yes, but what happens if you break it? Is it a fine? What is that sound?" "It's not a fine," she said, her voice nearly a growl. "That sound you heard, Emily, that's the sound of a collection." "Collection?" "Yes. It comes when the silence is broken. It comes to take the noise. And whoever made it..." My blood went cold. "Take? What are you talking about? Is this a joke, Linda? Some stupid small-town legend? You think I have time for legends, dear?" She looked at me with such seriousness that I knew she wasn't joking. "Do you think the peace you admire is natural? It isn't. It's maintained. Maintained by fear and obedience." She led me to her living room window and pointed out at the street. Everything looked idyllic. "Last night, when your phone hit the floor, I heard it. I heard the noise in my house. And I heard the answer. Thank God it didn't make it to your door. But why would it come? What does it take?" My voice was a thread. "People," she whispered. "It takes the people who break the silence. It takes the noise away, so the rest of us can live in peace." I shook my head, trying to process it. This was insane. People disappearing because of a sound? In a Connecticut suburb? Who else knows this, Linda? The neighbors. Everyone. All of us know. That's why at 10 o'clock, you don't hear so much as a bird. Because we've all seen what happens when someone decides the rule doesn't apply to them. She stepped back from the window, her face pale. "You were lucky, Emily. Your noise was small. It came, it checked, and it left. But if the noise had been bigger, if it had been repeated, or if you'd been outside, it would have taken you." I remember the click, the sound of a latch. "You're saying something took someone because of a noise." Yes. Who? Linda hesitated. She walked to the fireplace and picked up a dusty photo frame. It showed a smiling couple, young, maybe in their 30s. These are the Harrisons. They lived in your house before you. They were young and they liked music. They thought we were old and foolish for being afraid. What happened to them? They threw a party on a Saturday. The clock hit 10:30, and the music was loud. The dragon came. It didn't leave. And when morning came, the house was empty. No broken doors, no shattered windows. Just silence. And it was a different kind of silence, Emily. A silence with weight. She set the frame back down, and dust rose into the air. The realtor told me they moved suddenly to California for work. Linda gave a bitter smile. No one moves suddenly in Willow Creek, Emily. They vanish. And the story is always the same. An urgent job transfer. That's how we keep the peace. I started trembling again, but this time it wasn't cold. It was pure horror. I'd bought a house from people who had been taken by some kind of creature because of loud music. And what is this, Linda? What makes that sound? We don't talk about it. That's the second silent rule. Don't name it, don't describe it, and above all, don't look for it. It only reacts to noise. If you're quiet, it doesn't know you're here. I went home that day, and the suburb I'd loved now felt like a luxury cage. The perfectly cut grass, the bright flowers, everything was hiding a swamp of fear. I started living by the clock. I caught myself walking on tiptoe even during the day, and I jumped at every unexpected noise. I tried to finish all my chores before 9 at night. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't listen to music. I whispered on the phone, even at 3 in the afternoon, afraid the sound would carry too far. I was going crazy. A week after the phone incident, I was eating dinner alone in the kitchen. It was 7:30 p.m. I was eating a salad, and the silence in the house was so oppressive I almost felt like I could hear it. Then I heard a laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. It came from the house across the street, the Parkers. They had a teenage son, Jake. Jake was a decent kid, always polite. I'd seen him playing basketball in the driveway over the weekend. I heard the laugh again, followed by a metallic sound, like he dropped something. Maybe a game controller. I shrank in my chair. It was 7:35 p.m. More than 2 hours before the hour. But Jake's laughing didn't stop. It was that careless, goofy teenage laugh. I looked at Linda's house. No lights on, no movement. A desperate urgency hit me. I had to warn Jake, but I couldn't shout. I left my house and ran to the Parkers' front door. I knocked, soft but firm. No one answered. I could hear the muffled sound of a TV on inside, and Jake's laughter. I knocked again, a little harder. The door flew open, and Mrs. Parker, Jake's mother, appeared. She was pale, eyes wide with panic. She didn't look angry. She looked terrified. "Emily, what are you doing?" she whispered, voice tight. "I heard Jake. He's laughing. And the TV is on. It's getting dark." She glanced back down the dark hallway. "He's gaming. He can't hear me. You have to make him stop. Linda told me about the rule. You can't make noise." Mrs. Parker yanked me inside, her hand cold and tacky on my arm. She closed the door as carefully as she could. "We know, Emily. We've tried. But he's a teenager. He has headphones on. He won't stop." Right then, we heard Jake let out a victory shout, followed by a crash, like he jumped up from his chair. "I won! I won!" he yelled, adrenaline in his voice. The clock read 7:45 p.m. Mrs. Parker shut her eyes, and a single tear slid down her cheek, the tear of someone who has already accepted what's coming. "It's too early," I murmured, trying to convince myself. "It's nowhere near 10. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice breaking. "If the noise is loud enough, it comes sooner. It reacts to excess. And Jake, he's been pushing the limit for days." We stood in the hallway, listening to the triumph of a boy who didn't know he was signing his own sentence. And then it happened. Jake's laughter stopped. The game music stopped. And the silence returned, but it wasn't normal silence. It was the silence that comes before thunder. I heard the sound. It didn't come from the street this time, like the first time. It seemed to come from behind the Parkers' house, maybe from the tree line behind the backyards. The drag. Slower, heavier this time. And with it, the sound of breaking wood, as if it were crushing fences or fallen branches. Mrs. Parker clapped her hands over her mouth, smothering a scream. The sound was moving toward the backyard. "Go home, Emily," she hissed. "Shut your door. Don't make a sound." I was paralyzed. I couldn't leave. I wanted to scream for Jake to run, but I knew any noise would make me the next target. The dragging stopped. It was right there, behind the Parkers' house. And then the breathing. That wet, rough sound, pulling air like a rusted engine. It felt like the air around us was being sucked into it. The floor of the house vibrated slightly. And then Jake, who must have pulled off his headphones and noticed the unnatural quiet, screamed. It wasn't a victory shout. It was panic. The kind of scream that recognizes danger. "Mom! What is that?" The scream was the password. The dragging turned into a sprint, a deafening racket of metal and earth, rushing toward the living room window. Glass shattered, violent, grotesque. I heard Jake's mother scream, and I turned and ran. I ran out of the house, not caring about the noise of my own feet on the asphalt. I could only run for my own front door. As I ran, I heard the most terrible sound of all. The click. But this time it wasn't a locking click. It was a closing click, followed by a hollow, muffled sound, like a steel door slamming shut fast over something soft. And then absolute silence. I threw myself inside my house, shut and locked the door. I pressed my back to it, gasping, waiting for the dragging to return. But it didn't. The peace had been restored. I didn't dare look out the window. I sat on the floor, my back against the wood of the door, the smell of sweat and fear wrapping around me. It took hours before I could stand. When the sun rose, I was exhausted and hollow. I got dressed and went out into the street. The Parkers' house was intact, except for the living room window, which was broken and covered with a sheet of plywood. I walked up and rang the doorbell. No answer. I knocked. Mrs. Parker opened the door. She was wearing a robe, her face swollen, yet strangely calm. "Mrs. Parker, Jake, and Mr. Parker." "They moved," she said in a flat voice. "Urgent job transfer. California." She wouldn't meet my eyes. She was repeating the story everyone repeated. I looked at the boarded window. "They took him, didn't they?" The noise was too much. Mrs. Parker only gave a small nod, without making a sound. "I'm sorry, Emily. You shouldn't have come here last night. You broke the rule. But I was trying to help. The rule doesn't allow exceptions. Now please go home. And remember, 10 o'clock. Silence. If you don't make noise, it has no reason to come for you." I went back to my house feeling like I'd witnessed not just an abduction, but the moral collapse of an entire neighborhood. They weren't only living with fear, they were living for it. They sacrificed their own children to keep the peace. I sat in my living room, staring at the clock. I had a decision to make. I could run, or I could try to understand what that thing was that moved with sound. But I knew that if I investigated even a little, if I made the slightest noise, I'd be the next one collected. I had to be quieter than quiet. I had to find the truth without even whispering. Fear taught me to be invisible, and I was determined to survive Willow Creek's silent rule. But to do that, I needed proof. And proof makes noise. And I knew the next time the drag came, it would come straight to my door. And the clock was already running. I had to be fast. And above all, I had to be silent. I had to be fast. And above all, I had to be silent. The first thing I noticed after that horrible night was that daytime in Willow Creek was no longer a relief. It was just rehearsal. People walked the sidewalks with forced politeness. Smiles were thin. And their eyes, God, their eyes always looked tired, as if they'd spent the whole night watching the dark. They greeted me, asked about the move, but it was all hollow. It was like the entire neighborhood was living under a glass lid, waiting for the hour when it would be pressed down again. I barely slept. My head turned into a war room. I needed real equipment. I couldn't rely on my phone. I needed something that could capture sound in high definition and record in total darkness. Driving to the next town over was a temporary relief, just to breathe air that didn't stink of contained fear. I came back with a kit that looked like something out of a spy movie, but I disguised it as bird-watching and nature observation gear. After all, I lived in Connecticut. That sounded normal. I bought a small, discreet night security camera and a professional audio recorder, voice-activated, with microphones sensitive enough to catch a butterfly's sigh. My plan was simple in theory and suicidal in practice. I would create controlled noise and monitor the drag's response. But before I risked my skin in my house, I needed more information about what, exactly, happened to people who broke the rule. I needed to talk to someone who looked close to cracking. Mrs. Taylor, with her obsession with azaleas and her permanently frightened stare, was the perfect candidate. I found her watering her flowers around 4 in the afternoon. The sun was strong, and the piece looked genuine, which made everything feel even more sinister. "Mrs. Taylor, good afternoon," I said, trying to sound relaxed, but my heart was pounding. She turned, and her smile was so thin it looked ready to snap. "Emily, dear, everything all right?" "Everything's great, thanks. I just wanted to ask something about, well, the neighborhood. I'm new, and I've heard some strange rumors." She stopped watering. The hose slipped from her hand, and water ran toward the curb. Her eyes swept the street, searching for something that wasn't there. "Rumors? What kind of rumors, dear?" Her voice was a whisper, even in broad daylight. I decided to go straight at it, but with coded language. "About the community rules. About the silence. I know you all take it very seriously. I'm wondering, what happens when someone doesn't?" Mrs. Taylor pressed a hand to her chest, right over the little bird pin she always wore. She looked like she might have a heart attack. "Emily, you need to understand. Willow Creek is a special place. A place of peace. And peace demands sacrifices. You've adapted well. You're doing everything right. But Mr. Walters, in the house at 412, what happened to him? He moved suddenly, didn't he?" All the color drained from her face, as if I'd said the forbidden word. "Mr. Walters, he wasn't a peaceful man, Emily. He was loud. He liked his music loud. He didn't respect the agreement." She leaned closer, and the smell of wet earth and fear was almost physical. "You heard what happened, didn't you? The drag." I nodded. "I heard it. But what is it, Mrs. Taylor? Is it the police? Some kind of special alarm?" She looked at me with deep pity, like I was a child about to set my own house on fire. "It isn't an alarm, dear. It's the price. The drag, it comes to collect the noise. And when it takes the noise, it takes the source. It takes the person. Walters, he tried to resist. He screamed. And the next day, the house was empty. No one saw him leave. No one saw him pack. He simply vanished. But where did he go?" She gripped my arms with surprising strength. "He went where the noise goes, Emily. Into eternal silence. Please, for the love of God, don't make noise after 10. Don't call it. You have a beautiful life here. Don't ruin it with curiosity." She backed away quickly, snatched up the hose, and began watering her azaleas with frantic intensity, as if water could wash our conversation away. I went home shaking. Mrs. Taylor hadn't given me concrete proof, but she confirmed the rule and the punishment. This wasn't an urban legend. It was a survival pact. And the drag wasn't an annoyed neighbor or the police. It was something that took people away. I had to act fast. It was already Wednesday, and I couldn't stand the tension anymore. The plan was this. I would mount the night camera in the back window, aimed at the fence and the small patch of grass that bordered the dark woods. I'd place the audio recorder in a strategic spot near the porch, hidden in a pine shrub. And the noise? I needed something that would be loud and unmistakable, but that I could trigger from a distance. I searched the garage until I found what I needed, an old mechanical alarm clock from the 70s. The metal kind with 2 bells on top. When it rang, it sounded like a truck horn in your living room. I taped it inside an empty metal paint can. The can would amplify the sound and, most importantly, give the drag a clear target that wasn't my front door. I set the alarm to go off at exactly 10:03 p.m. 3 minutes of tolerance for the neighborhood to settle, and 3 minutes for me to hide. The afternoon crawled by heavy. I felt like a condemned woman building her own gallows. I tested the camera, checked the recorder. Battery full. Alarm armed. At 9:30 p.m., Willow Creek's ritual began. Lights in the neighboring houses started going out. Mr. Parker's TV fell silent. The few cars on the street slowed and disappeared. The air turned cold, even though it was summer. I locked myself in the upstairs living room, where I had a clear view of the street and the yard. I turned off every light in my house. I was invisible, but I felt exposed. At 9:55 p.m., I was lying on the floor behind the couch, laptop open, monitoring the night camera feed. Everything was gray and grainy, but I could make out the silhouette of the metal can near the fence. The silence was physical torture. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the pressure it carried. like the air was being pulled out of the world. 10 o'clock. On the dot. Everything stopped. I held my breath. I could hear my blood pounding in my ears. I looked out at the street. Nothing. No movement. But I knew they were there. The neighbors, motionless in their beds. Tense, waiting. Did they know what I was going to do? Had they noticed I'd gone out to buy equipment? 1 minute. 2 minutes. A cold knot formed in my stomach. What if the drag came before the alarm? What if it was waiting for the smallest sign of disobedience? 10:02 and 50 seconds. I counted down. 10, 9, 8. The sound came, and it was deafening. The metal made the alarm clock resonate in a way that felt violent. The sound was high and relentless, a mechanical scream in the middle of that enforced peace. I flinched, clapping a hand over my mouth so I wouldn't make a sound. The neighborhood's reaction was immediate. Even though I didn't see anyone, I felt it. A light that had been on in the Harrison house at the end of the street snapped off instantly, like power had been cut. A car parked along the curb, which had looked empty, blinked its interior light on and off, one nervous flash. Silent panic. The alarm kept shrieking, merciless. I stared at the night camera feed, fixed on the fence line. And then the other sound started. It didn't come from the woods. It came from somewhere along the main road, maybe 3 blocks away. This time, it wasn't the slow, heavy drag I'd heard before. It was fast, urgent. Metal scraping asphalt or concrete at terrifying speed. Like something enormous being hauled along at a sprint, sliding, but grinding with friction. The sound was loud, vibrating in the air, cutting the silence like a scalpel. It was coming, and it was coming fast. I felt the floor tremble. A low vibration you felt more than heard, like the engine of an underground train. The alarm was still screaming. I desperately wanted it to stop, but I couldn't go outside to shut it off. The drag was a block away. I could make out more detail now. It wasn't just scraping. There was a secondary sound, a deep, wet wheeze, like the thing was breathing or straining as it moved. And then, suddenly, it was on my street. I forced myself to keep watching the screen. The grainy gray image shuddered. It wasn't moving on the asphalt. It seemed to be traveling across the neighbors' lawns, just behind the line of fences. Then the figure entered the edge of the frame, right along the side of the house. It wasn't a car. It wasn't an animal. It was a mass. A dark mass, darker than night, that seemed to absorb what little infrared light the camera could throw at it. It was large, awkward, but it moved with brutal efficiency. I couldn't make out limbs, but there was a shape, a silhouette that suggested weight and bulk. The dragging sound came from its base, as if it had no feet, no wheels, only a rough surface grinding against the ground. It stopped exactly at the fence. Less than 10 yards from the metal, that was still screaming. The alarm was doing its job, calling attention. For 1 second the mass did nothing. It just hunched there, folded in on itself. Then I heard a sound that wasn't on my recorder, but I felt it in my bones, a click. Like bone or metal adjusting into place. Then the mass stretched, and something thrust out of it. It was long and thin, ending in something wide and serrated. It looked like a butcher's hook, except organic. The hook came down on the fence, thin wood, and snapped it with a sharp crack. The thing was reaching for the noise. The hook moved again, impossibly fast, and struck the paint can with the alarm clock inside. The RRRRIJNNN stopped instantly. It wasn't silenced. It was crushed. I heard metal buckle, followed by absolute silence. The mass stayed there in the dark, hook extended. And I could smell it, a strong, metallic, moldy stink that somehow rose up to my closed window. I was frozen. I'd seen it. But what had I seen? On the screen, the mass began to move again, not away. Toward the house. It had taken the noise, but it knew the noise had been placed. The scraping started up again, but now it was softer, more cautious, sliding over grass. Scratch, scratch. It was coming for the front door. I crawled away from the laptop, my body shaking uncontrollably. I had to get the audio recorder. It was outside, in the shrub, only a few yards from the thing. But I couldn't go out. I heard a loud sound downstairs, a heavy thump, followed by a horrific scratching at the wood of the door. It was sniffing. I could have sworn I heard a suction sound, like a giant vacuum, right at the threshold. I backed away from the window. If it saw me, it was over. I stayed there in the dark, listening as the drag inspected my house, searching for whoever had made the noise. It scraped along the side of the house, and I heard soil being torn up, probably the shrub where the recorder was hidden. My stomach dropped. The recorder! If it took the recorder, I'd have nothing. There was another stretch of silence, the longest and most terrifying of all. It felt like it was deciding. Then the sound returned, pulling away slowly. The wheeze and the dragging faded back toward the main road and eventually disappeared into the distance. I waited until the sun began to brighten the horizon, turning the sky a dirty gray. When I finally dared to go downstairs, it was 5:30 a.m. Outside was silent devastation. The fence was broken, ripped in half. A deep gouge cut through the lawn, as if a giant plow had passed. And the shrub where I'd hidden the recorder was destroyed, branches and dirt everywhere. I ran toward it, panic taking over. And there it was, the recorder, lying in the mud, but intact. It must have been thrown clear at the moment the thing attacked the shrub. I grabbed it and pressed it to my chest. I had the recording. I had proof of the sound and the neighborhood's reaction. But the most important thing I noticed, as I stared at the deep gouge in my lawn, was the absence of something. The groove was deep, but there were no footprints, no tire tracks. It was a continuous, clean furrow, as if a razor had sliced through the surface of the earth. The thing was heavy, but it left no conventional tracks. And there was something else. In the middle of the lawn, where the dark mass had stopped, there was a small object. What was left of my alarm clock. The paintkin was crushed, but the twisted metal mechanism of the clock was still there. I crouched and picked it up. It was ice cold, and stuck to it was a substance. It wasn't blood, but it was organic. A thick, black mucus with a strange sheen. It smelled of salt, iron, and burned electricity. I wasn't dealing with an animal or a maniac. I was dealing with something that defied nature. I ran back inside, triple-locking the door. I needed to hear the recording. I connected the recorder to my laptop. The file was large. I hit play, and the morning silence shattered with the sound of my own experience. The recording began with ambient noise, wind, the distant hum of a plane. 10:03 p.m. The alarm blared. Then the drag. The fast SKR, rushing closer. I heard the hook breaking the fence, and then the alarm scream being crushed into silence. But what came next made my blood freeze. The drag was close to the microphone. The scraping stopped. And then I heard it. It wasn't just the smell. It was a sound that seemed to come from inside the microphone. A low, nearly inaudible noise that the recorder's quality captured perfectly. It was a voice, not words. A murmur. A deep buzz, like the thing was trying to communicate without vocal cords. And inside that buzz, I heard a distinct sound, a short, sharp squeal. I froze. I rewound and played it again. It wasn't a squeal. It was the sound of a word. It sounded like, "Where?" I was losing my mind. I played it again, louder. And yes, the drag was trying to speak. It was asking where the source of the noise was, or maybe where I was. I sat in my living room as the sun finally poured through the windows, lighting dust and fear alike. The recording was proof. This wasn't a ghost or an illusion. It was something physical, something that could speak, or mimic speech, and that had intelligence. And the worst part, it knew I was here. The neighborhood had warned me about silence. They had made a pact to protect themselves. But now I had broken the pact loudly, drawing attention to my house. That twisted piece of metal and the black slime on my lawn were a warning. The drag had come for the noise, but it had left without a human source. It was irritated. I knew the next time the clock struck 10, it wouldn't come looking for an alarm clock. It would come straight for me. I had proof. Now I had to figure out what it was. And if I was going to survive, I couldn't hide anymore. I needed a plan that went beyond silence. I needed to understand the rule, so I could break it for good. I looked at the clock. It was already 6 in the morning. I had 16 hours to figure out how to confront the silent rule of Willow Creek. And I knew the answer lay in the one thing they feared more than the drag: noise. I needed to make the loudest disturbance Willow Creek had ever heard, but I had to make sure that when the drag arrived, I was ready to send it back to whatever hell it came from. And I needed allies. I needed to find someone who had tried to resist before, someone who knew that thing's weakness. But how do you find an ally in a neighborhood bound by a pact of silence? I picked up the phone. I couldn't call the police. They'd say I was crazy. I needed specialized help, I started researching urban phenomena in Connecticut, legends of isolated communities, anything that might give me a clue about the mass that scraped the ground and whispered where. As I searched, I felt the weight of the neighborhood's eyes on me. They knew I'd survived the night, and they knew that if I made noise again, the price would be paid by all of us. I was the black sheep, the threat. I thought of Mr. Walters, the man who liked loud music. He'd screamed, he'd tried to resist, and he'd vanished. If I wanted to understand the drag, I had to understand Mr. Walters. It took courage to leave the house, but I did it at lunchtime, when street activity was at its peak, to look harmless. I went to number 412. Empty. Silent. Lawn perfectly trimmed. I knocked. Of course, no answer. I walked around the house, peering through windows. Everything looked clean. But in the backyard, behind a stack of firewood, I saw something strange. It wasn't a drag track. It was a dark stain on the wooden fence, low to the ground, like something had been dragged there. And next to the stain, pinned to the wood, was a piece of paper. Small. Folded. Held by a rusty staple. I waited until a neighbor walked by, pretending to admire the garden. When the coast was clear, I hopped the fence and grabbed the note. I unfolded it. The handwriting was rushed, shaky, written in pencil. It's not the sound, it's the frequency. They're monitoring the frequency of peace. Noise is what breaks the field. Use the opposite. Use vibration. It's the only way to stop it. Signed H. Walters. He'd left a message. He knew something. Not the sound, it's the frequency. What did that mean? The drag didn't come just because of a loud alarm. It came because the noise created a disturbance in the silence the neighborhood maintained. And what was the frequency of peace? It was as if absolute silence were a protective barrier, and any noise cracked that barrier, letting the drag in. I went home shaking with fear and excitement. I had the recording, proof of the thing's intelligence, and now I had a clue. Vibration. The opposite of noise. If I was going to fight, I needed something that vibrated, something that created a powerful frequency capable of repelling or disorienting the drag, but without being the kind of noise that summoned it. I had less than 10 hours to find a way to create massive, silent vibration. I looked at my equipment. Cameras. Recorder. None of that produced vibration. I needed something industrial. Something that dealt with sound in a physical way. The answer came when I looked at my basement. It was dry, but the foundation was old concrete. I remembered a college physics class on sound waves and resonance. If I could find the drag's resonant frequency, maybe I could break it apart, or at least stun it. But I didn't have time for calculations. I needed a speaker, a subwoofer, big, capable of generating low-frequency waves strong enough to make the ground shake. I grabbed my car keys. I had to move fast. The next town was 30 minutes away. I had to be back before the sun started setting and the neighbors began their nightly ritual. I left Willow Creek feeling like I was escaping a prison. At the electronics store, I bought the most powerful subwoofer they had, the kind used at rock concerts. The salesman gave me a strange look and asked if I was throwing a party. No, I said, forcing a tight smile. I'm going to make a little silence. I came back to Willow Creek hauling the heavy speaker. It was already 5 p.m. The sky was turning orange. I could feel the neighborhood's nerves. They were watching me. I dragged the subwoofer into the basement and hooked it up to my amp and my laptop. I had the drag's recording on my computer. If I could isolate the sound of its voice, maybe I could invert the sound wave and use vibration to cancel out its frequency. I worked frantically, using audio editing software. I isolated the squeal that sounded like the word where. I looped it and started manipulating the low frequencies. The sun went down. 8 p.m. I was in the basement, the air smelling of dust and electronics. 9 p.m. The neighborhood lights began to go out. I had to be ready. I had to test the subwoofer. I turned the amp on at the lowest volume and played the low-frequency wave I'd made, based on the drag's sound. The basement floor trembled slightly. It wasn't an audible sound, but a deep vibration you felt in your bones. I shut it off immediately. I couldn't risk the neighborhood feeling the vibration. 9:45 p.m., 15 minutes to 10. I was ready for war. The subwoofer sat in the center of the basement, aimed at the foundation. I had a hammer in my hand in case the drag tried to come in through the basement door. I went upstairs, closed the basement door, and sat in the living room, like the night before. I looked out the window. Total darkness. The silence, crushing. 10 o'clock on the dot. Willow Creek's silent rule was in effect. I opened my laptop, pulled up the modified audio file, and waited. I wasn't going to make noise. I was going to generate a frequency that, I hoped, would make the drag regret coming after me. I prayed Mr. Walters had been right. I prayed vibration was the answer. I waited 5 minutes. The silence was so thick I could barely breathe. I pressed play. Downstairs, the subwoofer went to work. There was no sound upstairs, but the floor trembled. Not like an earthquake, like a steady, deep vibration saturating the house's concrete. I imagined the frequency wave pushing out through my foundation, spreading under Willow Creek's lawns, breaking the frequency of peace. I waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes, and then I heard it. It wasn't the drag rushing in fast, like last time. It was different, an alert. It came from the main road, high, almost a wail. Not the drag itself, but its reaction. The drag was coming, but it was hesitating. The scraping started, but it was uneven. Scratch, pause, scratch. It could feel the vibration. I braced myself. I knew it would come to my house. I had to be ready for the final confrontation. I had to see what Willow Creek's silent rule really was. And I had to survive to tell it. After that night, after I'd seen the shadow drag itself along the street, slow and heavy, and heard that sound that wasn't quite a sound but a scraping in the soul, I knew Willow Creek's peace was a lie built on the rawest fear. I'd watched the silent rule in action, and the price of breaking it was total erasure, as if the person had never existed. The worst part was not knowing what scared me more, the thing that came after 10, or the absolute coldness of the neighbors who allowed it. I spent the next few days in a state of permanent vigilance. I started studying the suburb, but not with maps or records. I studied people. I watched Mrs. Taylor watering her perfectly trimmed flowers at noon with that forced smile, and I saw Mr. Walters, pale and thin, repairing the porch step he'd broken the night of my warning. Everyone acted like nothing had happened, but there was something in their eyes, an old terror hidden under the facade of immaculate lawns and clean cars. I tried to talk to Mr. Walters. His name was George. George, I said softly, approaching him as he came back from the mailbox. About that night, are you okay? I saw what happened. He stopped, his hand trembling slightly on the handle of the small cardboard parcel he was holding. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I don't know what you're talking about, Emily, he said, his voice dry. I fell. It's fine. Just a loose step. No, George. I saw the shadow. I heard the suction. I know you made a noise and it came to collect. Why don't you talk about it? What is that thing? He finally looked up, and what I saw wasn't denial, it was pleading. Emily, please, he whispered, and he seemed to have aged 10 years in a week. The rule. You know the rule. Don't talk about it. Ever. It's the only thing that keeps us here. If you talk, if you make noise, it'll know you're aware. And it'll come for you first. He backed away quickly, almost running into his house, shutting the door with impossible care. That night I made a decision. I couldn't live like this. I'm a person of noise, music life. That forced silence was a prison, and I'd rather face the jailer than rot in the cell. If I was going to leave, I needed to know what it was. If I was going to stay, an idea that made my skin crawl, I needed a weapon. And the only weapon I had was information. I prepared my house. I took my phone, turned on the recorder, and left it by the second-floor window pointed toward the street. I covered every window with black blankets, so not a thread of light could leak out. I dressed in dark clothes and sat in the living room with a digital clock in front of me, waiting for the inevitable. The tension began to climb at 9:30. It was as if the atmosphere itself was getting thicker. The air inside my house felt heavy, almost oily. I could hear my own blood pounding in my ears. 9:40. The last car on the street, probably someone coming home from work, sped up a little, hurried, desperate to reach safety before the limit. 9:50. The silence was so complete it hurt. It was a vacuum, a silence that screamed. I wondered if somewhere in Willow Creek a baby was crying. And if it was, I knew the mother would do the impossible to smother the sound. 10 o'clock. The digits flipped, and the world stopped. I held my breath, my eyes locked on the darkness beyond the window. I could smell cold dew rising off the lawn. Then it started, not loud, not a roar. A very low vibration, a frequency the ear barely caught but the body felt. Like the earth breathing wrong, one deep, hungry exhale. I crawled to the window, staying below the sill. I could see the street. There it was. Not a monster the way I'd imagined. No visible teeth or claws, even though I knew it had something that took people. It looked more like a stain in the air, a mass of shadow darker than night, moving slowly as if it floated an inch above the asphalt. The thing. The collector. It moved carefully, inspecting houses. I could feel its attention even without eyes. Heavy, inquisitive. It was searching for irregularities. For life. For sound. It stopped in front of George Walters's house. My heart kicked hard. George had made noise recently. The thing was checking the scene. The dark stain stayed there for a full minute. I could hear my phone recording the silence and that low vibration. I was so focused I forgot to breathe. Then the shadow moved. It didn't drift away. It stretched, thick black smoke, and began to climb George's wall. I heard a faint creak, a tiny groan, the sound of wood under pressure. I knew George was inside, probably lying on the floor, shaking, praying the thing wouldn't find him. It was inspecting, searching for the weak point, the sound that would betray him. And in my desperation, my anger, I did the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever done. I broke the rule. I grabbed the heaviest pot I had, cast iron, and moved as fast as I could to the back door that opened to the yard. I knew the sound would travel. I needed something sharp, sudden, so violent it would force the thing to pull away from George's house. I opened the back door with absurd care and positioned myself. I checked the clock. 10:07 p.m. With everything I had, I smashed the cast iron pot against the side of my metal grill. The sound exploded, a deafening clang that ripped through the night's silence like lightning. Pain flared in my ears, but the effect was immediate and terrifying. The thing, halfway up George's house, stopped dead. The black stain contracted as if it had been electrocuted, and it turned toward me. I didn't see it move, but I felt the speed of it. In a blink it was at my fence. Massive, shapeless darkness. It wasn't slow anymore. It was furious. I stumbled back inside, slammed the sliding door, and locked it. I was gasping, frozen. The shadow spilled over my fence and began to drag itself across my lawn. I could feel the ground vibrating under my feet. I knew I had no chance. I'd condemned myself. But then I heard another sound. Not a pot, an alarm. Not police or ambulance. A car alarm, loud and shrill, coming from the street. And it wasn't just one. Suddenly Willow Creek, the suburb of silence, erupted into noise. Car alarms went off in sequence from multiple directions. Horns started blaring, some short, some long and frantic. The neighbors, they heard my sound. They saw the thing turn toward me. And for the first time, they broke the pact, not to flee, but to protect me. The thing hesitated. The black stain began to writhe, confused, overloaded by the sonic assault. It was too much, too chaotic, too much life. Over the horns and alarms, I saw Mrs. Taylor in her upstairs window, flicking her bedroom light on and off in a frantic strobe. The thing couldn't focus. It was being attacked from all sides by what it hated most, the cacophony of human existence. Slowly, painfully, the shadow began to retreat. It dissolved, not in a sprint, but in a recoil toward the center of the street where the darkness was deepest. Then, with one last low sigh of that vibration, it vanished completely. Silence returned, but this time it wasn't the forced silence of submission. It was the silence of exhaustion. The horn stopped. The alarms died. The light steadied. I collapsed onto the floor, shaking uncontrollably. I'd survived, and I'd seen the community react, not as cowards, but as one body, using noise as a shield. 15 minutes later, there was a knock on my front door. It wasn't a cop's knock. It was soft, hesitant. I opened it. It was Mrs. Taylor, George Walters, and an older man I'd never seen before, Mr. Whitaker, who lived at the end of the street. They came in, and Mrs. Taylor hugged me. I froze, shocked. She smelled like lavender and fear. "You shouldn't have done that, Emily," she whispered, but there was a strange pride in her voice. "But thank you. You saved George." "What is this?" I asked, my voice raw. "Why the silence? Why did you help it go away?" Mr. Whitaker, who looked like the oldest and most exhausted of the three, sat down in my armchair. "We'll tell the truth now, child," he said. "Willow Creek's silent rule is older than we are. This land doesn't like noise. It doesn't like progress. Before it was a suburb, it was hunting ground, and before that, it was a place where something slept." He said that generations ago, when the first white settlers arrived and started cutting down trees and building, the noise of civilization woke something. "It isn't a monster that wants to eat flesh," Mr. Whitaker went on. "It's a collector. It collects what disturbs the peace. It's drawn to sound that doesn't belong to the land's silence. Machines, loud laughter, music, fights, and most of all, the sound of fear. But why the absolute silence after 10? I pushed, because we learned the hard way that if all of us stay completely quiet, still, no sound of life, it passes. It thinks the houses are empty, that the town's been abandoned. It's a trick. It's how we pretend we don't exist for a few hours, until the sun comes up and it goes back to sleep." George Walters added, "When you made noise, Emily, it came for you. But when the noise became a chorus, an attack of disorganized sound, it can't process it. It doesn't know where to focus. Silence feeds it, but sonic chaos repels it." Mrs. Taylor squeezed my hands. "We don't like living this way, Emily. But it's the price. If you break the rule alone, it takes you, and we lose one of us. If we break it together, we drive it off, but we remind it we're here. It's a risk we only take in extreme cases like yours." I looked at them, those tired, frightened faces. They weren't monsters. They were prisoners who'd gotten used to the chains. "You're going to live the rest of your lives like this?" I asked. "We have to," Mr. Whitaker said, resignation heavy in his voice. "The cost of leaving is high, and the cost of staying is silence. We chose silence because this is our home." That night, I understood Willow Creek's truth. The peace of that suburb wasn't natural. It was a rigorous performance of non-existence. They lived a life of whispers and slow movements, always waiting for the sun to go down. I stayed awake all night, thinking. I'd survived the silent rule, but I couldn't join it. I was too loud, too alive. I didn't want to spend the rest of my days terrified of dropping a glass. At sunrise, when Connecticut's golden light began to spill over perfectly kept lawns, I started packing. I didn't make noise. I moved like a ghost, folding clothes, emptying closets. I didn't want to alert the thing, and I didn't want my new, strange friends trying to stop me. When the moving truck arrived, right on time at 7 in the morning, I was already on the curb with my boxes. The driver, a young guy who looked like he'd just woken up, started talking loud, cheerful. "Morning. Man, this place is quiet. Ready to go, ma'am." I stared at him so hard he swallowed. "Quiet," I ordered, my voice low and firm. "Whisper only. Move fast. And don't slam doors." He looked at me like I was crazy, but he did what I said. As the boxes were loaded, I saw Mrs. Taylor on her porch watering her flowers. She saw me and only nodded, a silent recognition of my choice. George Walters was in his window, and he raised a hand, almost a goodbye, almost pity. I got into my car and took one last look at my house, the green grass, the blue sky. It was the perfect American suburb, beautiful, deadly. I started the engine, but before I pulled away, I did one last thing. I rolled down the window and grabbed my phone. I played the audio I'd recorded the night before. The sound of my cast iron clang, followed by the chaos of horns and alarms, echoed briefly down the street, a final shout of defiance. I saw Mr. Whitaker at the end of the street flinch for a moment, but he didn't look at me with anger. He looked at me with something like deep understanding. Then I drove off, leaving Willow Creek behind. I never went back. I sold the house remotely. I live in a city now, in a noisy apartment downtown. I hear horns, sirens, loud music from neighbors. It's chaotic, it's messy, but it's safe. Sometimes, when the clock creeps toward 10 at night, I feel that tightness in my chest, that leftover fierce silence taught me. I catch myself freezing, listening to the air, waiting for the low vibration. But then I hear the rumble of a train, or someone shouting on the street, and I breathe again. I know the silent rule still exists out there in Willow Creek, maintained by those who chose submission to survive. And I know that for some people, silence is the price of peace. But for me, silence will always be the sound of danger, and I'll never hush myself again. I escaped, and the only thing I carried with me was the certainty that the greatest horror of all is the one that forces us to live in silence. And I'll be loud until the end.